Hey everybody, I wanted to make a quick video to show you guys some of the ideas I had for the camera control assignment working here at home. I know we're all locked in at this point and coming up with ideas to make photographs might be kind of hard when you're just stuck in your house. So I took a crack at making some shots for each of the categories for the camera control assignment in and around my house and just on the street in my neighborhood. And I wanted to share some of that with you, talk to you about the idea behind the photograph and then some of the settings I used in the camera to achieve it. So here we are in Lightroom. And you can see I'm in my catalog. I have all my photographs. What I've done is I've gone through and I've rated all of the photographs that I think work well for this project with the star rating. So you guys can see that a lot of these are rated up here and down. And then what I did was created a collection where I sorted by all of my starred photographs. So down here, I can say filter and say flagged, actually no, rated. And I'll select rated, and then I want it to show me anything that's rated with a 5-star or higher, and that sorts it automatically, so it just shows me my rated images. So what you can see here is I have all my images that are rated 5 stars. And what I can do at this point is if I select the images that I want for my camera control assignment, I can grab them here, and then if I hit create collection, what it'll do is ask me to title that collection, and then it'll put those images into that collection. So select them first, then hit the plus button on the collections. I'll title this camera control 2, so I already have one, and hit create. And now you can see I have this camera control collection here that's just those images. Now I already did a basic cut down of those in a different collection, so I'm going to show you the ones I have here. So let me just walk you through this. So I started with the shallow depth of field portion of the assignment. So if I bring this up full screen, you can see here that I have this very, very shallow depth of field focusing on this one droplet of water that's on the edge of, this is actually a mulberry that's growing on my mulberry tree. I shot this with a 50mm lens. You can see I'm at an f1.8, which is wide open on this lens. And I'm at an ISO of 200 and at a 640th of a second. So a relatively fast shutter speed, a pretty low ISO because I'm able to go wide open at the 50mm lens. And what you can see is I have this very, very, very blurred out background, even to the point where not even the whole mulberry is in focus. I just have this like millimeter thin slice of focus here. And it looks okay, but what I think I'm noticing is there's some sort of blurriness around the edge of the water droplet. So the next shot I did, I took it at a f3.5, which is probably more similar to what your guys' cameras can do. And you can see I get a much sharper water droplet there. And most of the mulberry is now in focus. So if I do a side-by-side actually with these two images, I can show you what I'm talking about. So on the right is the 1.8mm shot, and on the left, I'm sorry, that's not right, there we go. On the left is the 1.8mm shot, and on the right is the 3.5mm shot, or the 3.5 aperture shot. So you can see on the 1.8 aperture, I get a little bit of blurriness around the droplet, and on the 3.5 aperture, I have that really nice, crisp, and sharp. So I think in this case, both images have a pretty shallow depth of field. You can see the 1.8 is more shallow, more blurred out in the background, but the 3.5 certainly satisfies the requirement for the shallow depth of field. The only difference here is that the 3.5 aperture image is a little bit too dark, so all we need to do is brighten that up to make it match, looking more closely to that. But 3.5 is certainly sufficient for getting a very shallow depth of field. The key here is getting close enough to your subject that the stuff in the distance is far enough away that it'll get nice and blurry. So let me show you now another example of a shot taken with a very shallow depth of field, or rather with a very wide open aperture, but it's not quite as shallow as we would like. So here's a shot I took, again, with the 1.8 aperture on the 50mm lens. And I focused on this fire hydrant here. And you can see the fire hydrant is nice and sharp. I do have a nice shallow background, but you can make out this stuff in the back. You can see there's cars and trees and things. And that fire hydrant isn't quite as isolated as I would want off of the background. Now I can start playing with different settings. So here I moved a little closer to the fire hydrant. I tried to get closer so that the difference between the distance from my camera to the subject and then my subject to the background, that difference is bigger. And it did create a slightly shallower background. So again, I can show you that side by side here. This is the 1.8 moving a little bit further away from the hydrant. This is the 1.8 moving a little bit closer to the hydrant. And you can see that those cars in the background are a little bit blurrier, or a little bit more blurry in the shot taken closer to the hydrant. So I'm successfully separating the hydrant off of the background a little bit better. But it's still not quite as blurry as I would like. And the only thing I can really do is keep on moving closer since my aperture is all the way wide open at this point. So I did keep on going. And let's see, one of these has a deep depth of field. Yeah, okay, great. So moved even closer now. This shot right here was again with the 1.8 aperture. And so I really like the way we're getting that separation now from the background. So you can see the fire hydrant's really nice and sharp, and the street now is really blurry, and the cars in the background are getting even more blurred out. So I like the way that this fire hydrant is separating off the background now. Now I did do a shot at 3.5 just so you could see the difference at this sort of level of closeness. And if I put those side by side, again, you can see the 1.8 on the left and the 3.5 on the right. And we are about exactly the same distance away from the hydrant, exactly the same composition in the frame. Just the aperture being that much more wide open is giving me a much softer background. In particular, if we zoom in here, you can see the leaves on the street are much more blurred, much softer than on the 3.5 image. Both have a pretty reasonably shallow depth of field, but I like the shallow depth of field much better in the 1.8 version than the 3.5 version. So I decided to keep on moving even closer. And I got right up close to the hydrant, isolated a portion of it, and shot a detail. And now you can see I have an incredibly shallow depth of field, much more similar to the shot that I took of the mulberry earlier. And you can see I have really nice sharp detail, but I have a very narrow slice of the hydrant that's actually in focus. It's just this front corner. You can see by the time it gets back to this bolt back here, it's already gone way out of focus. But I do have this really nice soft background. Took the same shot at 3.5, and you can see now I have much more of the hydrant in focus. Pretty much the whole front face of that cap is in focus. Still a pretty nice blurry background. But again, if I go side by side, you should be able to see there's a pretty big difference between the two. Yeah, so 3.5 on the left, 1.8 on the right. So you can see how much more blurred out that background is, how much more shallow the depth of field is with the 1.8 aperture. Both would work just fine for this assignment. So if you don't have a lens that can go all the way to 1.8, 3.5 is perfectly fine. You just got to get closer to your subject. If you want that background to go more and more blurry, you got to get closer to your subject and have a great distance between your subject and the background. That's how you're going to achieve that effect. So just to show you what I did next, I wanted to do a deep depth of field shot here. So same picture of the fire hydrant, but this time at f16. So I changed my aperture all the way to f16, which required me to go down to a 50th of a second. But I was still not getting enough exposure. And if I went any slower than a 50th of a second, I would get a motion blur from my hand shaking. So I had to raise my ISO up to 400 to account for that. Now, we can see now that we have much more clear background. The cars are in focus, the trees across the street are in focus, generally speaking, and the hydrant is in focus. So again, just to put that side by side with one of the shots from earlier, let's go with this one. Okay, so we have f16 on the left and f1.8 on the right. about the same composition, about the same distance away. So you can see what a difference that makes, just changing the aperture to a deeper depth of field. We can see the cars in the background. You can see how much more blurry they are in the 1.8 shot on the right versus the 16 shot where they're perfectly clear on the left. So that's how you want to approach the depth of field portion of it, the shallow depth of field. I have a couple more examples I can show you just for kind of fun. Here's a shot that I made on the street with a deep depth of field, again at an f/16. So I found this bush that had these nice purple flowers on it along the sidewalk, and then I shot down the sidewalk with a single point perspective going all the way into the distance to carry the depth of field. So I got down a little bit low. I was probably about 6 to 8 feet away from this bush with a 50mm lens. I composed it so it was in the bottom left-hand side of my screen, and then that allows this path to go into the distance, and it's sharp all the way down until you get to the very end where it starts to get a little bit blurry. But the fence here and everything is really nice and sharp. Had this kind of cool solar flare, sun flare thing coming in from the top right-hand side because the sun was coming through this bush. And I think that that's a pretty nice shot. I like the way that the sun is hitting the bush here and illuminating these flowers. So then I took the same shot, but with a shallow depth of field, which you can see here. The lighting's a little bit different because I got out of that sun that was hitting my lens. But what you can see is that I have, again, the bush nice and sharp, highlighting the flowers, but the path goes real nice and blurry down towards the end. And you can see I have these little cool circles being created that is light reflecting off of the bushes up here in the distance. And because they're out of focus, they create these little points of light. And this is called bokeh. It's the shape that the images take, or rather the detail takes as it goes out of focus on into the distance. So these cool little circles are called bokeh. And again, if we put that side by side with the first shot, you can see how much more in focus the plants are in the distance, in the sidewalk in the distance, on the 16 aperture versus the 1.8 aperture. But again, basically it's the same exact shot, same exact composition, just slightly changing the settings so that we have this very cool shallow depth of field. All right, moving on. Another shot I made that is a cool example of a shallow depth of field is I saw this reflection in a puddle on the sidewalk of some tree branches up above and a cloud in the sky. And what I did was I focused on that reflection. And when you focus on a reflection, you're actually focusing on basically the distance from the actual, the distance from the actual object, right? In this case, the branches to the lens. So from the lens to the reflection, then from the puddle back to the branch, that's the total distance. So 30 feet, 40 feet, whatever it is, right? And because we're focusing on that distance of about 40 feet away, the sidewalk goes out of focus very dramatically. Again, this is on the 1.8 aperture. And so all these little points of light that are reflecting off the sidewalk become these nice soft little bokeh effects. And we have this one area of sharp focus within the frame, which is the branch and the pond, or in the little puddle reflection. So I thought that that was a fun approach to shallow depth of field. Okay, a couple more little shallow depths of field things right here. We have a nice little detail of some water droplets on an succulent. And so again, this was just on the street. The light was coming through in a nice way and hitting this leaf in a way that highlighted the little droplets and created these little shadows and stuff. So I shot this one at a f/3.5 to get a little bit more of the droplets in focus as it was going back. And I was able to shoot this at an ISO 100 and at 1/300200th of a second. So very, very fast shutter speed. And that's because the direct sunlight was hitting this plant. So if we zoom in, you guys can see all the detail in the little water droplets, and it looks really nice. But again, a 3.5 aperture is something most of you can achieve with your lenses, and it does give you this really nice shallow depth of field. And I think it looks really good. All right, another just example of shallow depth of field, some flowers I found on the walk. This one was a leaf sitting on a railing. So I isolated that leaf with a very small aperture, 3.5 again, and have that one leaf in focus. And as the rail goes into the distance, it becomes more and more out of focus. So that's my depth of field portion of it. I did more sort of deep depth of field ones, but you guys got the point of that through this shot and then the fire hydrant shot before. I'm going to be doing an HDR demo here in the next couple of days, and I have some more shots that have a deep depth of field that I can show you in the HDR lecture. But let's move on to the shutter speed portion of this assignment, because we have motion blur, still motion, so stopping motion, freezing it in place. And then we have panning, which is the one where you pan the camera along with something that's moving so that you keep that object still, but the background blurs behind it. And then we have combo, which is a combination of both some sort of shutter speed technique and some sort of depth of field technique. So I'll walk you through what I did with those. But first, let me show you my fast shutter speed shots, where my kids were playing with their gymnastics equipment in the garage. So I was taking some pictures of them jumping. And what I did was had my aperture set to 1.8, right? So wide open to allow enough light to come in and get enough exposure that I could use a fast shutter speed. And so in this case, my shutter speed was at 1/1600th of a second. And that was fast enough to get my daughter pretty much suspended in midair without having too much blurriness. Her face is slightly blurred, but for the most part, she's pretty still. I would need to do some cropping of this image and rotating it to make it straight, but that'll be for another video when I go through some of the editing tools. But you guys can see the technique here, at least where she's frozen in midair, jumping off of the beam. That one's relatively easy. My son did a couple too. He dabbed in one and then did some sort of air guitar thing and another, which I think worked out pretty good. This one was at 2,500th of a second, so he's frozen up there in the air. So the fast shutter speed stuff is relatively easy. You just have to have enough light. So in this case, the garage door was open. It was sunny outside. My house was sort of behind us, which was white. So they had a lot of light reflecting off the house and then bouncing into the garage. So even though they weren't in direct sunlight, they were getting a lot of ambient light bouncing back into the garage to illuminate them enough. So you just need enough light that you can use these faster shutter speeds to get them motion still. I don't recommend bumping your ISO really high to try to get faster shutter speeds, because you'll get a really grainy image. I recommend just finding an area that is brighter. So going outside in the sun, if the sun comes out at some point. I know it's cloudy right now, but that's what you want to do with those. Is just find a bright enough area, use a wide open aperture and a very fast shutter speed, and just find something that's moving. It's as simple as having some kid jump up and down for you, right? Okay, so moving on to motion blur. Same scenario. I had my daughter working on some gymnastics stuff in the garage again, and she was doing a cartwheel on her floor beam. And so I was able to change my aperture to an f13. I dropped my ISO all the way down to 100 because I wanted to slow my shutter speed down to 1/10 of a second. And I was able to get her midway through a cartwheel across the beam using this technique. So I wasn't on a tripod, and I probably should have been, because you guys can see there is a little bit of blurriness in the background here. And if I got on a tripod, then I could have had this perfectly still and would have looked a lot nicer. But the idea is there. So even at 1/10 of a second, you can reasonably kind of handhold something. I would recommend being at like a 15th or a 30th if you're going to try to handhold this, and just photographing something that's moving relatively quickly. But the point of this, or the key here, is that you want to balance out your aperture so that you can use those slower shutter speeds and not overexpose your image. So I had to, again, move to an f13 and ISO 100 to get the exposure right at the slower shutter speeds that I needed. In this case, 1/10 of a second. Okay, so that takes care of the motion blur and the stop motion images. Now I want to show you what I came up with for pan. I didn't go out in the neighborhood trying to find cars that were moving or anything like that. Instead, what I did was I held my hand out in front of the camera and kind of rested my camera on my arm, and then turned my arm left to right, kind of in a circle, like rotating my circle, and at some point through there, fired a shot. And what you can see is my settings were at 1/10 of a second, just like the last shot. I had to be at an f/22 for this one because it was brighter out in the yard, and then at an ISO 100. And what you can see is my hand is still, because it's moving along with the camera. So my camera is sort of attached to my arm, and my arm and camera are moving at the same rate. And because of that, the background, the wood fence here, is blurring across while my hand remains still. So that's the whole idea about panning, is that you match the motion of your subject with the motion of your camera so that the background blurs across without the subject blurring. Same idea if a car was driving by, if you could match your camera's motion to the car as it's going past, the car will remain still and the street and the houses in the back of it will blur across. So this is something that you can easily try on your own in your backyard. You could go out in front of your house and try to get some cars moving along, or maybe if you have children at home, you can have them riding a scooter or something on the sidewalk and get them with that panning technique, and it shouldn't be too hard. But again, using a slower shutter speed, about 1/10 of a second or so, and then balancing out your ISO and your aperture to make sure that your exposure is going to look good. Okay, so lastly, let me show you my picture for combo. So I decided to go with a fast shutter speed, shallow depth of field combination shot. And this is what I came up with. Again, going back to the gymnastics studio with my kids. My daughter was doing some work on the bar, and she, this is called a cast, where you basically launch yourself back with your hips up off the bar and get kind of horizontal with the ground, so you can see her foot in the background here behind her up off the ground, and she's kind of holding herself up with her arms. But in order to get this fast shutter speed, again, I had to be at an f1.8, and that gives us a really shallow depth of field. So I put my son in the background just to emphasize that shallow depth of field. So I have these two subjects aligned, one on top of the other, and one perfectly in focus here with my daughter making that kind of funny face, and then my son in the background, I think he's playing drums on the mat or something like that. But that's my shot for combo. So again, plenty of opportunity to take these pictures at home. You just kind of have to think creatively with what you want to accomplish. Remember, the point of this exercise is to get your camera settings right to achieve the look of the image. It's not necessarily to make some sort of profound image that speaks to something. If you can accomplish that as well, good for you. But the main goal is to achieve the technique through the camera settings. And then later on, you guys can apply these techniques to your work in a way that makes sense for the content. But for right now, we're just trying to master the technical skill. Okay, so that's all for now. I'm going to make another video shortly about editing some of these images, so I can show you some more of the tools in Lightroom for editing. But that's all I wanted to show you for this video. So we'll see you at the next one.